When a billionaire's credit card was declined at a grocery store, everyone laughed. Everyone pointed. Everyone enjoyed watching him fall. But then, a little girl in worn-out shoes did something that made the entire store go silent. She reached into her pocket and pulled out $18. Every penny she had in the world. Money she'd been saving for months for a doll she desperately wanted. And she gave it all to a complete stranger. What happened next didn't just change his life. It changed an entire city. And by the end of this story, it might just change you too. This is a true story about the day a child taught a grown man what real wealth actually means. Stay with me, because what you're about to hear will restore your faith in humanity. Welcome to the Quantica channel. While you are here, please hit the subscribe button and comment your view on the story and where you are watching from. You know, sometimes life has a way of teaching us lessons when we least expect it. And sometimes those lessons come wrapped in the most painful packaging imaginable. This is a story about one of those moments, a moment that changed everything for a man who thought he had the world figured out. Picture a Tuesday afternoon at a local grocery store in a quiet neighborhood in Chicago. Nothing fancy, just your regular store where families do their weekly shopping, where the floors are a little worn and the fluorescent lights hum softly overhead. The kind of place where everybody knows the cashiers by name, where kids beg their parents for candy at the checkout line, where life moves at its own comfortable pace. On this particular afternoon, the store was busy. Shopping carts squeaked down the aisles. Mothers compared prices on cereal boxes. And the steady beep, beep, beep of items being scanned filled the air like a familiar song. Everything was ordinary. Everything was normal. Until it wasn't. A man walked up to register 3. His name was Daniel Morrison, though nobody in that store knew it. He wore an expensive navy suit that probably cost more than most people spent on rent. His shoes were polished to a mirror shine, and his watch caught the light every time he moved his wrist. Everything about him screamed success, power, money. Daniel had built an empire in real estate. He owned office buildings, shopping centers, apartment complexes across 3 states. His signature was on contracts worth millions. His phone never stopped ringing with people wanting his time, his money, his approval. He had climbed so high that he'd forgotten what the ground felt like beneath his feet. But here's the thing about being on top. Sometimes you forget that the ground is still there, waiting. The cashier, a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and a name tag that read Janet, began scanning his items. Organic vegetables, expensive cuts of meat, imported olive oil, the kind of groceries that spoke of a life lived comfortably. The total came up on the screen, $147.63. Daniel barely glanced at it. He reached into his wallet and pulled out a black credit card, the kind that has no spending limit, the kind that whispers, "I'm important," without saying a word. He handed it to Janet with the casual confidence of someone who had never been told no. She swiped it. Once, the machine beeped. A red light flashed. She swiped it again, a little slower this time, making sure the strip ran clean through the reader. Another beep, another red light, and then in bright letters on the screen, a word that made time stand still: declined. For a second, nobody moved. Daniel stared at the screen like it had just spoken a foreign language. Janet's eyebrows went up in surprise. And then, slowly, people started to notice. Card declined. Janet said, loud enough that the people in line behind Daniel could hear. She wasn't trying to be cruel. She was just doing her job. But her voice carried, and in a small store like this, sound travels fast. The woman directly behind Daniel leaned to her friend and whispered something. They both smiled. Not nice smiles. The kind of smiles people wear when they see someone powerful brought down to their level. "Try another card, honey," Janet said, her voice dripping with a kind of pity that felt worse than mockery. Daniel's jaw tightened. His face, which moment ago had been calm and confident, now flushed red. He fumbled through his wallet, pulling out another card, then another. His hands, which had signed million-dollar deals without trembling, now shook slightly as he handed Janet a gold card. She swiped it. Declined. Another card. Declined. By now, the whispers had grown louder. People weren't even trying to hide their amusement anymore. A teenage boy pulled out his phone, probably to record the moment. An elderly man shook his head with a satisfied look that said, well, look who's not so special after all. And Janet, good old Janet, she laughed. It started as a chuckle, then grew into a full laugh, her head tilting back as if this was the funniest thing she'd seen all week. Maybe it was. Maybe watching a man in $1,000 suit, unable to pay for groceries, struck her as cosmic justice. Daniel stood there, frozen. His whole body felt heavy. Shame, thick and suffocating, wrapped around him like a blanket. He'd stood in boardrooms with the most powerful people in the country and never felt small. But here, in this ordinary grocery store, surrounded by ordinary people, he felt like he was shrinking, disappearing into the floor. And then he felt something else. A small hand tugging at his jacket. He looked down. Standing beside him was a little girl. She couldn't have been more than 8 years old. She wore a faded pink t-shirt with a cartoon character on it, jeans with patches on the knees, and sneakers that had seen better days. Her hair was pulled back in 2 ponytails tied with mismatched ribbons, one blue and one yellow. Her eyes, big and brown and filled with something Daniel hadn't seen directed at him in years, looked up at him with pure concern. Not pity, not amusement, just simple, genuine concern. She didn't say anything yet. She just stood there, her small hand still gripping the edge of his jacket, as if trying to steady him in a moment when everything felt unsteady. And in that moment, something inside Daniel began to crack. Now, let me tell you something about children. They see the world differently than we do. We adults, we've learned to put people in boxes. Rich, poor, successful, failure. We judge before we think. We laugh before we feel. But children, they haven't learned all that yet. They just see people. Humans. Hearts that can hurt. This little girl. Her name was Emma, though Daniel didn't know that yet. She stood there in that checkout line, watching the stranger struggle, watching the adults around her enjoy his pain, and something inside her said, "This isn't right." The laughter continued. Janet was still chuckling, shaking her head as she waited for Daniel to figure out what to do next. The line behind him had grown longer, and people were getting impatient. Someone muttered, "Can we get a move on?" Another voice said, "Maybe you should try the dollar store next time." Each word was like a small knife. Daniel had heard criticism before. In business, you develop thick skin. But this was different. This wasn't about a failed deal or a bad investment. This was about him as a person, being reduced to nothing in front of strangers who would forget his face by tomorrow, but would remember the story forever. You should have seen this guy in a fancy suit who couldn't even afford his groceries. Emma watched his face. She saw the way his eyes were starting to shine with tears he refused to let fall. She saw how his breathing had changed, quick and shallow, like someone trying not to break down. She saw his hand gripping the edge of the counter, so hard his knuckles had turned white. And then she looked at the groceries. Bags of fresh vegetables, chicken breast, pasta, sauce. Normal food. Food that families need. Nothing crazy, nothing extravagant in the moment. Just food. She thought about her own home. She thought about the times her mama had counted pennies at the kitchen table, trying to figure out how to make rent and still have enough for dinner. She thought about the nights they'd eaten cereal for dinner, because that's all they had. She knew what it felt like to need something and not have enough. But here's what made Emma different, what made this moment possible. She didn't think, well, he's rich, so who cares? She didn't think, he probably deserves this. She just thought, he needs help. Emma reached into the pocket of her jeans. Inside was her treasure, money she'd been saving for 3 months. She'd earned it by helping neighbors carry groceries, by returning bottles to deposit, by saving every quarter her grandma gave her. She'd been saving for a new doll, the kind with a fancy dress that she'd seen in the store window and dreamed about for weeks. She pulled out the money, 3 $5 bills, wrinkled and soft from being folded and unfolded 100 times, and a small handful of coins, quarters and dimes and nickels that jingled in her palm. The total in her hand was about $18 and change. It wasn't much. It wouldn't even cover half of Daniel's grocery bill. But it was everything she had. Every penny. Every dream. Emma took a deep breath, the kind you take before you do something scary, and she stepped forward. Her small hand reached up toward the counter, toward Janet, toward a moment that would change everything. "Excuse me," she said, her voice tiny but clear in the sudden quiet that had fallen over the store. Janet looked down, surprised. The laughter died on her lips. "I can help," Emma said, and she placed her crumpled bills and her handful of coins on the counter. The coins rolled and scattered slightly, making small clinking sounds that seemed impossibly loud. The store went completely silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Every person in that line, every person who had been whispering and laughing and judging, suddenly stopped. They stared at this little girl in her worn-out clothes, offering her money, her precious money, to help a stranger. Daniel looked down at the money on the counter, then at Emma, then back at the money. His throat tightened, his vision blurred. This child, this tiny human being who clearly had so little, was trying to rescue him. "Sweetie, you don't have to," Janet started to say, her voice completely different now, soft and shocked. "Please," Emma interrupted, looking up at Janet with those big eyes. "Please take it. He needs food. Food is important." Daniel's knees felt weak. He crouched down, bringing himself to Emma's level. Up close, he could see the worn threads on her shirt, could see that her shoes had been taped on one side where they'd split. This child, who had nothing, was offering him everything. "Why?" he whispered, his voice cracking. "Why would you do this?" Emma tilted her head, confused by the question. "Because you need help," she said simply, as if it was the most obvious thing in the world. "And when people need help, you help them. That's what my mama taught me." Tears, real tears, filled Daniel's eyes. For the first time in 20 years, he cried. Not in private, not in the darkness of his bedroom, but right there in a grocery store in front of strangers. He cried because this child had shown him something he'd forgotten existed. Humanity. Pure, simple, beautiful humanity. The woman who had been smirking earlier now had tears in her eyes, too. The teenage boy with the phone had put away, his head bowed. Janet was wiping her eyes with the back of her hand, completely undone by what she was witnessing. In offering $18, Emma had given Daniel something worth far more. She'd given him hope. You know what's interesting about moments like these? They don't just change the person receiving the kindness. They change everyone who witnesses it. That grocery store in Chicago, on that ordinary Tuesday afternoon, became something extraordinary. It became a place where people remembered what really mattered. Daniel stayed crouched there for a moment longer, eye to eye with Emma, trying to find his voice. Finally, he managed to speak. "What's your name?" he asked softly. "Emma," she said with a small smile. "What's yours?" "Daniel." It felt strange saying just his first name. Usually it was Mr. Morrison or Sir or that real estate guy. But here, with this child, he was just Daniel, just a person. "Hi, Daniel," Emma said, and the simple warmth in her greeting made his heart crack open even wider. Behind them, something beautiful was happening. The woman who had been first to whisper, and Judge now stepped forward, reaching into her purse. "I'll cover the rest," she said quietly, placing $200 bills on the counter. Her voice shook. "I'm sorry. I'm so sorry for laughing." Then the elderly man who'd shaken his head with satisfaction earlier came forward. "Put mine on there, too," he said, adding more money to the growing pile on the counter. "I was wrong. Dead wrong." One by one, other people in line started pulling out their wallets. A college student added a 20. A young mother with a baby on her hip added what she could. The teenage boy, the one who'd almost recorded the whole thing for laughs, emptied his pockets of every dollar he had. Janet, the cashier who had laughed the loudest, was now openly sobbing. "I'm so sorry," she kept saying. "I'm so sorry." She refused to take any of the money for the groceries. "It's on the store," she said firmly. "It's on me." But Daniel shook his head. He stood up slowly, wiping his eyes. "No," he said, his voice stronger now. "No, I want to pay. I need to pay." He pulled out his phone, made a quick call to his bank, and within minutes, the issue was resolved. A simple computer error had frozen his accounts. nothing more. But that simple error had led to this moment, this awakening. He paid for his groceries. And then he paid for Emma's family's groceries, what little they had in their cart a few registers over. And then he paid for the groceries of every single person in that store. Every cart, every item, every penny. He stood there for 40 minutes, insisting on covering everything. But more importantly, he talked to them. He learned their names. He heard their stories. The college student was working 3 jobs to pay tuition. The young mother was raising her baby alone. The elderly man had just lost his wife of 50 years. The woman who'd whispered first was struggling with her own business that was failing. Everyone had their own weight to carry. Everyone had their own decline cards, their own moments of shame and struggle, visible or invisible. When it was all done, when the last person had been helped and had left with tears of gratitude in their eyes, Daniel turned back to Emma. She'd been waiting patiently, sitting on a bench near the front of the store, swinging her legs. "Can I walk you home?" Daniel asked. "I'd like to meet your mama, if that's okay." Emma nodded, hopping off the bench. "Okay, but we have to walk. We don't have a car." They walked together through the neighborhood as the afternoon sun began to sink lower in the sky. Emma chatted about school, about her friends, about the doll she'd been saving for. Daniel listened to every word, like it was the most important business presentation he'd ever heard. Emma's home was a small apartment building, the kind with chipped paint and a front door that didn't quite close right. They climbed 3 flights of stairs because the elevator was broken again. Emma explained. She'd gotten used to the stairs. Emma's mother, Lisa, answered the door in a waitress uniform, clearly getting ready to head to her evening shift. Her eyes widened when she saw her daughter with a strange man in an expensive suit. "Emma, what's going on? Are you okay?" "I'm fine, Mama. This is Daniel. I helped him at the store, and he walked me home." Daniel quickly explained what had happened, his voice gentle and respectful. As he told the story, Lisa's eyes filled with tears. She pulled Emma into a tight hug. "Baby girl," she whispered, "what did I tell you about your money? That was for your doll." "I know, Mama," Emma said, "but he needed food. We can't play with food, but we can eat it. The doll can wait." Lisa looked at Daniel, and in her eyes, he saw what true wealth looked like. This woman, working 2 jobs, raising a daughter alone in a tiny apartment with worn furniture and walls that needed painting. She was raising a child who understood compassion, who understood sacrifice, who understood that people mattered more than things. "I'm sorry for any trouble," Lisa said to Daniel. "Emma has a big heart, sometimes too big." "No," Daniel said firmly, his voice thick with emotion. "Her heart is exactly the right size. She saved me today, really saved me, and I'd like to repay that kindness, if you'll let me." Lisa started to protest, started to say they didn't need charity, but Daniel held up his hand. "Please," he said, "let me do this. Not because I feel obligated, but because your daughter reminded me of something I'd forgotten. She reminded me why any of this matters." And in that moment, standing in the doorway of a small apartment in Chicago, Daniel Morrison made a decision that would change not just Emma's life, but his own. That night, Daniel couldn't sleep. He lay in his penthouse apartment, surrounded by expensive furniture and floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city lights, and all he could think about was Emma's tiny hand holding those crumpled bills, those $18, her entire savings, given without hesitation to a complete stranger. He thought about the way she'd looked at him, not seeing his suit or his watch or his expensive shoes, just seeing a person who needed help. When was the last time someone had looked at him like that? When was the last time he looked at someone else like that? Daniel got out of bed and walked to his window. Below, the city sparkled and hummed with life. Millions of people, each with their own stories, their own struggles, their own moments of needing help. How many of them had he walked past without seeing? How many had been invisible to him because he'd been too focused on his next deal, his next acquisition, his next victory? He'd built an empire, yes, but what had he built it for? To prove he could? To show everyone he was better? To hide behind walls of money and power? So he'd never have to feel vulnerable again? Emma had shown him vulnerability that afternoon. She'd stood there in worn shoes and a faded shirt and had been more powerful than he'd ever been in his finest suit because she'd been brave enough to care, brave enough to give, brave enough to see him as human. As the sun rose over Chicago the next morning, Daniel made phone calls, not to his lawyers or business partners or investors. He called architects. He called contractors. He called nonprofit organizations. And he started building something different, something that actually mattered. Within a month, the Daniel Morrison Foundation was born. But this wasn't going to be one of those foundations where a rich person writes a check once a year and puts their name on a building. No, this was going to be different. This was going to be personal. Daniel started showing up at grocery stores across Chicago. Not as grocery stores, just regular stores in regular neighborhoods. And he'd do something simple. He'd pay off people's grocery bills. Quietly, without cameras or press releases. He'd watch for the young mother counting pennies at the checkout, the elderly person putting items back because they couldn't afford everything, the single dad buying the cheapest options for his kids. And he'd step forward and say, "Please, let me get this for you." The reactions were always the same. Shock, disbelief, tears, questions about why. And Daniel would simply say, "Because someone showed me kindness once, and I'm passing it forward." But it didn't stop at groceries. Daniel started really looking at his city. He saw the apartments with broken elevators, like Emma's building. He saw schools with outdated textbooks and leaking roofs. He saw community centers that had closed due to lack of funding. He saw families living in their cars. He saw kids go to bed hungry. And for the first time in his life, instead of seeing problems that weren't his responsibility, he saw people who needed help. His help. He bought Emma's apartment building, not to flip it for profit, but to renovate it properly. New elevators, fresh paint, repairs to every unit. He hired Lisa full-time for the foundation so she could quit her exhausting double shifts. He made sure Emma got her doll and so much more. But here's what made it real, what made it matter. Daniel didn't just throw money at problems and walk away. He showed up. He sat in apartments and listened to people's stories. He volunteered at soup kitchens. He tutored kids at after-school programs. He learned names, remembered birthdays, asked about sick relatives. He started bringing his business partners along, too. At first, they thought he'd lost his mind. "Daniel, you're a real estate mogul, not a social worker," they'd say. But after spending a day with him, seeing what he saw, meeting the people he met, something shifted in them, too. One by one, they started joining him, donating time, money, skills. The transformation spread like ripples in water. 6 months after that day in the grocery store, Daniel stood on the stage at a community center in Emma's neighborhood. The place was packed with families he'd gotten to know, people whose lives had intersected with his in beautiful ways. Emma sat in the front row with her mother, wearing a new dress but still with those mismatched ribbons in her hair. Some things, the best things, don't need to change. "I want to tell you all something," Daniel said into the microphone, his voice steady but emotional. 6 months ago, I thought I was successful. I had money. I had power. I had influence. But I was empty. I'd forgotten the most important thing. We're all connected. We're all human. We all need each other. He looked directly at Emma. "A little girl taught me that. She gave me everything she had, $18, to help a stranger. She didn't know who I was. She didn't care. She just knew I needed help. And that one act of kindness changed everything." The room was silent, hanging on every word. So today, I'm announcing that 50% of my company's profits will go directly into this community and communities like it across the country. Not someday. Starting now. Because I finally understand what wealth really means. It's not what you keep. It's what you give. It's not what you build for yourself. It's what you build for others. The room erupted in applause, but Daniel held up his hand. And I'm asking every person here to join me. Not with money. You don't need money to change someone's life. Join me with kindness. See the person struggling in line at the store. Notice the neighbor who needs help carrying groceries. Smile at the stranger who looks like they're having a hard day. That's how we change the world. One small act at a time. Emma stood up and ran to the stage. Daniel crouched down, and she threw her arms around his neck. "You did good, Daniel," she whispered. "No, Emma," he whispered back. "You did. You showed me how." 5 years passed. 5 years of transformation, not just for Daniel Morrison, but for everyone his story touched. Because here's the beautiful thing about kindness. It multiplies. It grows. It spreads in ways you can never predict. That grocery store in Chicago, the one where it all began, they put up a small plaque near Register 3. It didn't tell the whole story, just a simple message. Kindness happened here. And whenever someone asked about it, the story would be told again and again. And each time it was told, it inspired someone new. Janet, the cashier who'd laughed, quit her job at the grocery store. Not because she was fired, but because Daniel's foundation hired her to run their community outreach program. She was good at it, really good, because she knew what it felt like to be on both sides of judgment. She taught others about compassion, about second chances, about the moment that changed her life. The woman who'd been the first to whisper and mock? She started volunteering at homeless shelters every weekend. She'd tell people, "I learned the hard way that you never know what someone's going through. Now I choose kindness first." That teenage boy who'd pulled out his phone to record, he did make a video eventually, but not the one he'd originally planned. He made a documentary about the foundation, about Daniel's transformation, about the power of one small act. It went viral. Millions of people watched it, and thousands more were inspired to do their own acts of kindness. Emma grew up. She went from 8 years old to 13, from a little girl to a young woman. Daniel made sure she had every opportunity. A great school, summer camps, music lessons, whatever she wanted. But you know what Emma wanted most? To help others, just like she'd always done. On her 13th birthday, instead of a party, she asked Daniel to take her to the foundation. She wanted to volunteer to serve meals, to tutor younger kids, to do what she'd seen Daniel doing all these years. You know, Daniel told her that day as they worked side by side sorting donated clothes, "I've been thinking about that day in the grocery store a lot lately." "Me too," Emma said, folding a small shirt. "I think about it all the time." "Do you remember why you did it? Why you gave me your money?" Emma paused, thinking. "I just remember thinking that everybody deserves help sometimes. And I had something to give, so I gave it. It wasn't hard to decide, you know? It just felt like the right thing." Daniel smiled, his eyes getting misty the way they always did when he thought about that moment. "You were braver than you knew, Emma. Braver than all those adults standing around. You saw past everything that didn't matter and focused on the only thing that did. Another person needed help, and you could give it." "But Daniel," Emma said, looking up at him, "you taught me something too. You showed me that one moment doesn't have to end. You took what I gave you and made it bigger, made it matter more. You made it last." And she was right. That one moment, those $18, that small act of kindness had become something enormous. The Daniel Morrison Foundation now operated in 15 cities. Thousands of families had been helped. Hundreds of kids had gotten scholarships. Dozens of buildings had been renovated. Countless meals had been provided. But more than the numbers, more than the money or the programs or the buildings, what mattered most was a shift in hearts. Daniel had learned to see people, really see them. And in learning to see, he taught others to see too. His business partners had started their own foundations. His employees volunteered regularly. Even competitors in the real estate industry had been inspired to do more for their communities. Kindness had become contagious. On the 10-year anniversary of that day in the grocery store, the city of Chicago held a special ceremony. They were naming a new community center after Emma, though she'd protested loudly, saying she didn't need her name on anything. "It's not about putting your name on a building," Daniel told her gently. "It's about reminding people what's possible. When they see your name, they'll remember that you were just a little girl who chose kindness. And they'll think, if she could do that, what can I do?" That's the legacy, Emma, not the building. The inspiration. At the ceremony, Daniel gave a speech. But this time, he didn't talk about his transformation or his foundation or how much money had been donated. Instead, he told a simple story. 10 years ago, he said to a crowd of hundreds, I was at my lowest point. Even though on paper I was at my highest, I had everything the world said mattered, and none of it could help me when I needed it most. But an 8-year-old girl with $18 could. She could because she understood something I'd forgotten. We're not here to accumulate. We're here to give. We're not here to stand above others. We're here to lift others up. We're not here to judge who deserves help. We're here to help, period. He looked at Emma, now 18 and preparing to go to college to study social work. This young woman changed my life. But what I want you to know is that each of you has that same power. You don't need to be rich. You don't need to be special. You just need to care. You just need to see someone who's struggling and think, I can help. That's all it takes. One moment, one choice, one act of kindness. The crowd stood and applauded, but Daniel wasn't finished. So I'm challenging every person here and everyone watching online to do one thing this week. Just one thing. Help someone. It doesn't have to be big. Buy someone's coffee. Help someone carry their groceries. Smile at someone who looks sad. Listen to someone who needs to talk. Be the person who sees another person's pain and doesn't look away. Emma joined him on stage, and together they cut the ribbon on the new community center. As the doors opened and families poured in to see the new space, with its library and computer lab and safe spaces for kids, Daniel felt something he'd never felt in any boardroom or at any business victory. He felt complete, because he'd learned the truth that Emma had known all along. True wealth isn't measured in dollars or buildings or power. It's measured in moments of connection, in acts of kindness, in the choice to help when you could just as easily walk away. That little girl in the worn pink shirt had given him $18 10 years ago. But what she'd really given him was everything. She'd given him purpose. She'd given him hope. She'd given him a reason to be better. And he'd spent every day since trying to pass that gift forward. Sometimes the smallest hands carry the biggest lessons. Sometimes the quietest voices teach the loudest truths. And sometimes all it takes to change the world is $18 and a heart brave enough to give it away.